Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you very much for coming along. I'm Professor Helen Petrie. I'm the Professor Emerita of Human-Computer Interaction at the University of York, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce this inaugural lecture by Professor Paul Cairns, as always somewhat delayed by COVID. So Paul is unusual in that he's come into HCI from a mathematical background. I actually had a quick look at his DPhil this afternoon and didn't understand a word of it, not even the title. But it's a really neglected and important part of HCI that we really need mathematical and statistical rigor in our research. So we really welcome his contribution. So after a DPhil at Oxford in mathematics and a short stint at Middlesex University, Paul moved to University College London, where he helped set up the Interaction Centre, one of the world-leading centres in human-computer interaction research. But we were very lucky that we were able to coax him back towards the north, and he came to York not long after I came to York, and was immediately plunged into developing and then being the inaugural program lead for our Masters in Human-Centered Interactive Technologies. And that has continued to be a very successful and popular course, and we've sent many students on to interesting jobs in industry and also in academia, and we have many PhD students who've come out of that program. And from there, Paul went on to be Deputy Head of Department for Research and now Head of Department. So a very steep trajectory. But in spite of that, he's managed to do world-class research at the same time on player experience and player engagement in digital games, which he's also passionate about. Also on the accessibility of games for people with disabilities, which I might have a little bit of responsibility for, and also on the use and widespread misuse of statistics in HCI research. So a very distinguished research career as well. As well, he's been a very supportive and interesting colleague to work with, and he's also a well-rounded human being who has a life outside academia, which not all of us have, with a wide range of very interesting hobbies, including playing the viola, bell ringing, and, wait for it, crocheting figurines of characters from digital games. I think that's right. And I have witnessed these, and they're really world-class. So Paul, the floor is yours to talk about measuring player experience.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Helen. That's a really warm welcome and a really nice introduction, so thank you very much for that. Being an expert in human-computer interaction, I'm actually entirely incompetent with technology, and I've just managed to break my mic. so having had a lapel mic, I'm now possibly chained to this desk microphone. And if any of you have seen me lecture elsewhere, you'll find that I'm going to struggle to stay next to this mic. But I'll do what I can to see to talk from here. So I'd like to talk to you about measuring player experience and what I consider to be maybe something of a paradox when we try to understand player experience as an objective scientific study and part of the discipline of human-computer interaction. Player experience is all about games, and it's really simple. Games are really big, okay? It doesn't matter how you think about games in modern society, they are huge. 50% of 60 to 64-year-olds play games on a regular basis. And that doesn't matter whether you think in the UK, Europe, USA, and actually anywhere where they gather statistics around this. It's a very large portion of the population, of the full population, play digital games on a regular basis. So they are massive. They are a sort of a huge feature of modern culture and modern life. And as I was writing these slides, I looked it up on Steam, and there were 803,000 people playing Counter-Strike Global Offensive at the time of typing. So literally at that point in time, there was 803 people playing a team versus team shoot 'em up game against each other. And so, you know, again, that's an astonishing number of people playing simultaneously. And that exceeds the number of simultaneous players on what were considered massively multiplayer games, such as World of Warcraft. Another way of counting it is just literally the number of games. I couldn't quite work out what this number was. Steam, which is a sort of game distribution platform, rather like the App Store, said it had 11,000 games published in 2021. I couldn't work out was 11,000 new games or 11,000 total, but either way, it's of that order of number of games on Steam, possibly appearing every year. And economically, it's hugely important to the global economy, to the UK economy, which is why we've got a UK interactive entertainment industrial body who look after this area. And according to Yuki, the games industry worldwide is worth about $178 billion US, which I looked it up in Wikipedia. It tells me that's greater than the GDP of Morocco, which is the 60th largest economy in the world. So games are big, okay? Whether it's players, number of games, or actually monetary value, which of course can be important as well. When I'm talking about games, it's very easy to kind of think, well, what do I mean by games? So I've just sort of given some highlights of different games just to show you what we might be talking about here. So this on the left here, the top left here, one of my favorites is Shadow of the Colossus. It's what you might think of when you think of really sort of proper high-end, what's called a AAA game. You're the adventurer on his knight, galloping through the massive landscape, pursuing the giant beast, which you ultimately kill, like many video games. But it's a great game, and it's incredibly atmospheric and sort of seminal in my thinking around games. But we've got a game where Patrick and I rather like playing called It Takes Two, which is a similar sort of high-end, high-quality game. You might just be able to work out there's actually two. It's a split screen of the same scene. We're both sitting on vacuum cleaner pipes fighting the evil vacuum cleaner. Which was, I tell you, it was a great experience, and many more other experiences like that as small figures working through a real-world scenario and actually playing collaboratively. That's the difference between, say, what might be considered the classic gamers who are actually playing together, and it was essential we played together and we played well together, which we mostly did. Wordle, of course, hit the news not so long ago as a hugely popular word game, very different in style and flavour from the other two. But nonetheless very popular, sort of a game to snack on, if you like. I spent 5 minutes of downtime playing. And then at the end there, we've got Monument Valley, which some of you might have seen featured in the television program House of Cards, which is essentially, if you look at it carefully, it's more like an Escher picture. There's an impossible waterfall of cycling around there, and your challenge is to navigate the little princess through the stages by altering the geometry in this sort of non-Euclidean, very much Escherian style. So games are various. They're very different. Little games snacking on, games which are played sort of in this sort of almost artistic, sort of on your mobile thing, and then these sort of bigger titles which can be played competitively, collaboratively, and so on. They're all very different. And I think that's worth bearing in mind. I'll come back to that. Why am I thinking about games? There are bigger problems in the world. So I've highlighted, this is a different problem I have worked on. This is what's called an infusion pump, and it's used to supply drugs at a very even rate in hospitals. It's very good for anesthesia. It can keep you a very steady, consistent level of anesthesia, unlike older technology, which basically give a big dose of anesthesia. When that wears off, give another big dose, and you get these sort of spikes in anesthesia, which can be quite dangerous. This gives a very even level of anesthesia. So this should be a much more interesting thing to work on, because this has usability problems. These things are really hard to program, and in the classic tradition is if you get the programming wrong, probably the best solution is to switch it off and switch it back on again. Which, if you think about it in the context of surgery, that suddenly becomes really quite a dangerous thing. So there's some serious problems with things like this. So why am I messing around with games, okay, when there's some bigger problems to be solved? Because one of the things that, when I was starting out way back at Middlesex, as Helen mentioned, when I was starting out, that was when HCI was really moving from thinking about usability and sort of the function of interactive systems, moving on from the things that we want systems to do, to thinking about the user experience. We need to think more carefully about the user experience of these things that we ask people to use. It's not enough that it has the function, it needs to give people the experience that they need. For instance, the confidence that they have programmed the device correctly. Not simply that they have programmed it correctly, but that they know they have and they are confident and they can trust the device to do that. And those feelings of confidence and trust are experience. And if you look at anybody who studies, well, marketing, experience matters. Marketers don't sell you the function, okay? They sell you the experience of the product, and that's true whether it's a car or a loo cleaner. If you look at the adverts on telly for these things, they aren't telling you what the function is. They're showing you the open road. They're showing you the joy and the spring in your step that comes from a very clean bathroom, okay? So it's experience that matters. And that, if you like, trumps the factor over function. Even if you get the function right, experience is still what dictates whether or not people use those devices for those functions. Still not quite got to games yet. Well, enter Emily Brown. Not that Emily Brown and Stanley, this Emily Brown. This is Emily Brown, who's she's now a lead experience designer at Us2 Games, which is are the makers of Monument Valley, which I mentioned just a moment ago. And in 2002, she was an MSc student at UCL at UCLIC with us. And she's a very keen and avid gamer, and obviously you can see she's made a career out of doing that, which is good for her. And she came to me as an MSc student saying, I'd like to do a project with you. And the simple question was, I want to know why aren't word processors as immersive as games? Very straightforward question. Why, why when we use word processors, why, you don't really get into it. In fact, often we begrudgingly use things like Word and go, okay, I'll get it to work. Yeah, okay, oh, it's moved that. Why has it moved that again? Okay, and eventually we get what we want, the document we want. But it's not an immersive and compelling experience in the way that digital games are. So it seemed like a reasonable question. And so my response is, what do you mean by immersive? Well, we didn't really know. We talked about it and we looked in some literature and we didn't really find out what the answer to that question was. What is immersive and what do we talk about this immersive experience? So we started researching games. Actually, there's another reason why I studied games. I really like games, okay? We've seen outside, so I've just been enjoying the exhibition. I think many of us have been. BBC Micro, Elite. Absolutely fantastic, okay? Absolutely, yeah, Dawn's nodding away. Absolutely fantastic game. It's a space adventure. There you are, flying a spaceship through the depth of space, and it looks like about a dock at a space station, if I've read that correctly. Really fascinating piece of software engineering as well, actually. And if you read The Backroom Boys, there's a fantastic essay about Bell and Braben writing Elite and managing to cram the functionality into a BBC Micro by basically ripping out, software-wise, ripping out its inputs and building it back up again properly. Amazing story. And Dave Braben is an honorary graduate of our department, more recently than 1984. But, that was the high end. That was the sort of top quality games. But, really, I cut my teeth on this game, which is called Quest, okay, which some of you, I think, are probably struggling to see even as a game. It's a bunch of ASCII characters on a screen. But I can tell you there, the characters stuck in the mountains and two men have fallen into a deep ravine. And I was clearly on my way to the castle to do some trading before I tried to cross the river. Okay, so you can see there's a game in there somewhere, but you've got to read it. I love that game. I think my parents, if you ask them later, will tell you just how long I spent playing that game. So I love games. I've been playing them all of my life. And so when the opportunity came along to research games, you think, it seems like a good idea. So back to immersion. So back to Emily Brown. So Emily went off and talked to players about their experiences. And what we did was we used qualitative research methods. It was actually the first time I used qualitative research to understand data. And we used grounded theory. And from that, we developed a theory of immersion, what it means to be immersed in a digital game. And actually, what it turned out to be was actually there's a graded experience. There's not just one thing. You start off with a certain level of engagement. And if the barriers are there, you don't get any further than that. But if those barriers are removed, you can get more into the game, more engrossed, more involved. And if you have even fewer barriers, so for instance, you've got more time to play and you've got more opportunity and you're building up your skill, you can get completely immersed. At the time, we called that presence, and I've used that word there, but now I wouldn't use that word. I'd use the word total immersion. Okay? So you're on this graded scale from engagement through to presence. So what? Well, that's great. We've got a theory, we've got a descriptive theory, but how are we going to use this to understand the experiences of digital games, where, if you like, a descriptive theory just tells you something's happening. There's this concept of immersion. But if we want to use it, if we want to have better immersion, if we want to avoid worse immersion, or if we want to avoid the possibility of too much immersion, we know about addiction in games and things as a possibility, what's actually influencing? We need some way of getting into the concept of immersion in a way which we can then understand it better. We need to be able to measure immersion. And this was really a sort of almost a gang effort of the folks at UCL at the time, where we were trying to understand how could we possibly measure immersion. And this is, if you like, the start of the paradox in HCI, which is we're talking about immersion. It's this thing inside your head, this experience. It's individual, it's to you, and it's lost in the, if you like, the depth of humanity, the who you are. But in order to pull it out into into experiments, into studies, we needed to make it objective. We need to give this nebulous, complicated thing happening in here a number. And we need to make that number meaningful and useful in terms of understanding the concept of immersion. So we tried various things. Myself, so it was led by Charlene Jennett, who was then a researcher and became a PhD student at UCLIC with Anna Cox, she and I did quite a lot of work together when I was at UCL and have carried on since. And various others, including some various MSc students in different projects and things. Andy Epps actually devised a questionnaire and so on. What did we find? We found that if you do eye tracking, you can kind of get something out of eye tracking, but it's really difficult to know if it's immersion. Something happens, might be immersion. We tried a questionnaire, that became the immersive experience questionnaire, and that kind of worked. That seemed to sort of get us something. And then one of my wackier ideas, we tried tangrams. These are the puzzles here. Which are where you take a square, you divide it up into these various triangles and parallelograms and things. And the puzzles are to put them back together to make various figures. Now, they're not this easy. What you get is the silhouette of the fox without the lines in between, and then you're told to make that with the tangram figures. Okay? So it's a puzzle. How would that help us to measure immersion? My argument was, if you were really immersed in this digital game, flying through space in your spacecraft, and you were suddenly stopped and asked to do this alternative task, with the tangram, you would be slower at doing it because your brain, if you like, is lost in space and you need to come back to a completely different task there in front of you. That also kind of worked, but it was quite hard to kind of reliably use. We're getting these very crude measures because basically it was a difference in timing between doing this twice, and it was quite challenging. So the questionnaire looked like the promising way of moving forward. Why use questionnaires? Why didn't I just ask, how immersed are you on a scale of 1 to 10? Okay, people can answer that sort of question. We can sort of do that. The question is, it kind of works, and you will get a rough answer. But the problem is, what are we really measuring when we do that? We are interested in a concept of immersion, and we're interested in something which isn't just stuck in my head, but is in the heads of everybody else in some comparable way. And so if I just ask you the question, how immersed are you? We may not even be talking about the same word. Okay, what I say by immersion, you might think of as presence, but you're using the word immersion for something else. And so we're answering the question, we look like we're behaving sensibly, but we don't really know what we're talking about. So the meaning of words vary. What I mean by that, the experience that I have of immersion may vary, because I'm a different person from you. And also the experiences offered by the games, which is what I'm ultimately interested in, that too may vary as well. So the games are differing, and the people are differing, and the meaning's differing, and so we need to kind of come through all of this to get something where we can ask a question where, if we can add it up correctly, we can get a proper measure of immersion. So we need some subtlety, and fortunately statistics, which makes me happy. So, what do we do? The basic item of a questionnaire. So what I'll do is just, this section is just sort of briefly give you a flavour of what it is that I'm doing when I'm measuring experience, trying to develop the notion of a scale or a measure. Basically what you do is you start with is Likert items. These are, if anybody's filled in a survey, you've probably recognised a Likert item. It's a statement, and then you're asked to give how much you agree or disagree with that statement. So, for instance, this is from the early days of measuring immersion. We used the item, I lost track of time, and you can answer that strongly disagree to strongly agree, with the idea being if you strongly agree, I guess you were a bit more immersed, you lost track of time. But we don't really know what that means. We don't need to worry about it. And you'll have seen these, I'm sure you've all seen these sorts of things in staff surveys and customer feedback surveys and the like. These are a very common thing. The key thing was all of these items, and this was the sort of insight from way back in 1932 that Likert had when understanding the measurement of attitudes around race and culture, was that these statements aren't precisely correct, but they do behave a little bit like numbers, the numbers you get out of them. If you convert strongly disagree to 1 and strongly agree to 5 and so on in between, you can use those numbers and those numbers behave sensibly. And you can then start add them up, make a scale, and you get some idea of what's going on. So what's happening there is that none of these items on their own are correct. They're all precisely wrong about defining immersion, but they contain a little bit of truth in them, a little bit of something which is meaningful and valuable that you can then get out of it. And so if you get that little bit of immersion, and then from somewhere else get another little bit of immersion, and somewhere else get another little bit of immersion, and add them together the right way, you can actually start to really define immersion. To give you an example of what this is like, I've chosen another thing which I'm currently quite obsessed about getting the first pictures from, which is the James Webb Space Telescope. It's an amazing telescope in all sorts of ways. It's the successor to the Hubble Space Telescope, which gave us amazing images of deep space. And the James Webb, there's all sorts of fascinating things about it. It's a huge mirror array floated at a Lagrange point somewhere out in the middle of space. It's just you know, you can geek out all day on it. It's absolutely fantastic. And this, because it's a complex array of mirrors out in space, which have just flown on a space rocket, when it was first unfolded and started to provide images, of course it's not properly calibrated. So what the clever folks at NASA did was they pointed it at a star where they knew it was probably likely to see just one star in its field of view, one very sharp, clear star. And this is the first image from the James Webb Telescope as a result of that. Okay, this is an image of one star reflected through all the various mirrors that are going on there. And for me, this is what you're doing when you're measuring immersion. We're trying to look at one sharp concept, immersion, but we don't know how to get to it. We know we can sort of get some level or quality of image behind these things, but we need to piece the pieces together. So we take something like this sort of jumble of things, and the first thing you do is you line them up. Okay, you line up the parts of the image, so you get stars, and so into this array. And so what you can see is actually that hexagonal array is reflecting the actual shape of the layout of the mirrors physically in the James Webb Telescope. So they'd adjusted them. And this is what you do statistically. You line things up using correlations, and you find out which of these things are lining up together, which of these Likert items work well together, and you put them into the right ordering to get that right. And then what they did next was they sharpened the image. They adjusted the mirrors at a small scale in order that you get nice, bright spots. So I'll shout so you can see there's a nice sharp spot compared to this blur over here, okay? So we get this nice sharp spots, and then when we've got all the sharp spots, we can pull them together into the bright image of the star at the end. Those bright spots are taken from forming the right words, the right Likert items, and using the statistics again to tell us which ones are the sharpest, getting most and closest to the underlying concept. And when we've got all of that set of items together, which we believe are sharp, individually none of these is as good as the final image, but when we put them all together, we get a lovely, sharp, crisp image of a star. And that's what we're doing with the statistics behind scale development. We're using the Likert items to get into the head, into this sort of this messy thing that we can't understand, and we're using a little bit to pull out all of these little bits of concepts which are reliably communicated between all of us, which are objectively correct, even though subjectively we're all experiencing slightly different things. Then we line them up the right way, and we can get a sharp image at the end, a sharp number which has a meaning around what the immersion is that we're experiencing. The difference between what I was doing and what the James Webb Telescope is doing is that the James Webb Telescope people knew they were pointing at a star. I didn't know I was pointing at immersion. Okay, that's the key thing, because I can't see it. There's no a priori way to understand that what's happening in here is immersion. And again, I'll come back to that. Suffice to say, for now, we believe it is. Okay, but let's have a think about that later. So we've got our measure. Now we call that measure the Immersive Experience Questionnaire. There's quite a few people in this room who've used it. I'm looking up at the PhD students at the back there. We can use it to measure all sorts of things. And because we can measure immersion, we can measure the effect of all sorts of different things on the experience of playing digital games. Okay. So, for instance, over the years, we've looked at things like screen size. We've looked at player perspective. Oh, yeah, so it turns out the bigger the screen, the more immersed people are. Player perspective, so first person versus third person. That's a classic sort of game mode. First person, you're looking through the eyes of the person playing, whereas third person is you've got a camera behind the person and you're watching them act as a player in front of you in the world. Controllers, the type of controllers you use, whether you use gestures or versus buttons. Time pressure, that affects, the more time pressure, the more immersed you feel, provided that's balanced correctly. Other players, they give you more sense of immersion if you play with others. And even lighting. So the classic thing of dimming the lights to play, that's more immersive. Okay? So we've done also things using this measure of IEQ to say that actually we understand what this subjective experience going on inside here and how to manipulate it. So I'll give you a concrete example of one of the pieces of work I've done. This was done with Elena as part of her PhD work, Elena Danisova. And it was really, there's a lot of work in games about producing better AI, better artificial intelligence underpinning the games. And so the game that Elena worked on, this is a game over here called Don't Starve. The character is there the job is to survive, and through, during the daytime you gather your resources and you manage your resources to see how they're going. And then at night time, the monsters and the creepy collie comes out and you've got to survive. And as you can see, this character's looking a bit cross and sitting on what looks like a buffalo that's also rather cross. I think he's doing quite well, but I'd have to ask Elena to be sure. And so what Elena did was she had two versions of the game, a standard AI, because this is an open source game, you can actually mod it yourself if you want to, a standard AI version of the game, and an adaptive AI version of the game. So what the adaptive AI did was it looked at how people responded, it looked at what the actions people were doing in the game, how they were playing, whether they were doing well, whether they were doing badly, and as a result of which would adapt its play style to kind of, if you like, make the game better for you, to last with you, keep you going, and so on. And what we found through Elena's experiment was that the adaptive version was much more immersive. So we can actually look very carefully at the use of different underlying technology to see whether or not it's actually more immersive. Of course, all of this is actually just made up. What Elena actually did was nothing at all to the AI and just told people what I've just told you. Okay? So not only does the AI technology underpinning the game affect user experience, what people think the game is doing affects their experience and can make the game more or less immersive. And in case you're wondering, later on in her thesis, Elena did unpack this a bit more and did do it with both that we had sort of two-way conditions, so we were definitely lying and telling them we were lying, we were definitely telling the truth and so on. And no matter what you do, adaptive is more immersive, even when people know they're being lied to. So there we go. So we're clearly able to make progress on immersion by using this. So it does, and this is where it gets, again, it's a strange paradox, which is, I think I'm talking about immersion. We've done all this work which seems to support what we've thought about immersion, and it seems to make sense. We seem to be getting sensible results based on what we think immersion is, which gives us some sort of support for the notion of immersion being a meaningful and a real concept. Well, flush with success from the Immersive Experience Questionnaire, why stop there? Okay? We know games aren't simple. There's not just one form of experience. So over the years, I've worked with all sorts of people to develop try and understand the different aspects of experience, the different parts of what's happening in here which build up the experience of your game. Eduardo Calvillo Gomez, isn't it cool? He's a games researcher, literally called games. He developed the Core Elements Questionnaire, which is basically looking at those things that get you to engagement, get you to the bottom level of engagement in a game. With Matt Hudson, who's both as a MSc by research and then a PhD student, we looked at the competitive and collaborative nature of games, so the idea of competing against each other, but also, as we saw in the It Takes Two earlier, actually collaborating with each other and seeing how what those experiences are in terms of how it feels to have competition, how it feels to have collaboration. And we call that the CPIG, CCPIG or CPIG. With Chris Power, who used to be in the office next door to me and is now at University of Prince Edward Island in Canada, we looked at uncertainty, the feeling of uncertainty, not being sure what's happening in a game. And to that end, we developed the PUGs. I worked with Heather O'Brien on a totally different area, looking at engagement in information systems. Heather had already developed I think it's the User Engagement Scale, the UES, and with Heather, when she was over here and I was on sabbatical, we worked on producing a short form which is now being very widely taken up and used in the information systems domain to understand the experience of engagement with things other than games, with library resources, for instance. Elena's also had a go at developing a challenge scale, and she led on that, though I helped out. as we had the pugs, she decided to call it the corgis. Can anybody ever remember what that scale stands for? But it's the maybe. It's a challenge. It's for measuring challenge, and it's the different types of challenge you experience through a game. Because of course, games can be difficult, but what matters is what you feel as the challenge as well. So what are the different types of challenge? And we can measure that, we believe, with the corgis. And most recently with Mjat De Jong, another PhD student of mine who's just finishing up, we've developed a short form of the IQ which might make it more useful to use multiple measurements in the multiple stages of playing the same game. So rather than just wait to the end of the game and ask about emotion, we can ask it multiple times and hopefully get some finer granularity on that. So you can tell I quite like making questionnaires. So is it true? Do I really understand what immersion is? Remember, I didn't know what I was pointing at when I pointed my telescope. Okay, we're pointing out into space, and unlike the James Webb Telescope, we didn't know there was a star there. Okay? Arguably, we still don't know there's a star there, but lots of evidence is that there is a star there from other sources. I don't have those other sources, but until we wrote the IAQ, we didn't know there's not another thing measuring immersion that we could use to draw. And so we therefore have to question, do we really have an objective truth? We're clearly doing something. We're moving from the subjective to something we can measure, which we can now manipulate, and it manipulates and works the way we think it works. But is that immersion? Is that the real thing? Well, we don't know. And we really have to step back and kind of go, look, we've got to be very careful with these things. We're talking about the vast complexity, 11,000 games a year of games. They're not one thing. Even the 4 that I put up there in the initial slide, they're all quite different from each other. You know, what is the similarity between them as games? Very little. Shadow of the Colossus and Wordle, almost nothing, okay? And players aren't one thing. We aren't just one sort of player. There's not just one thing that works for us. You know that yourself. If you play games, you like some things that your friends don't. You hate things that they like, and so on. We're different in that way. So is immersion really only one thing? And actually, is immersion in some sense real? Okay. I'm not sure. Just to highlight you the idea that not all games are the same. A little bit hard to see. I should have chosen a slightly lighter screenshot. This is Zelda Breath of the Wild, a game greatly beloved in my family. And you could just about make it out. Oh dear, what have I done? There we go. I'll try and use this little gadget. There you go. There's Link. Just about to see Link is sitting there as the character looking out onto this landscape. We've got a shrine, that's the lovely glowing things there. We've got some ruins in the near distance, but I don't think you can just vaguely see a vague shadow where my mouse pointer actually is. That vague shadow is one of the giant creatures, mechanical creatures that's floating in the sky, and is actually part of the main story of the game. What happens when you play these games? This isn't just a game that's different from Wordle and different from Shadow of the Colossus. This is an open world game. What you do in this game, you do whatever you like. Okay, that's the basic point. There is a story, there is a game, there is a big bad Ganon at the end that you need to defeat in order to liberate Hyrule from its tyranny. You don't have to do that. Okay, so working with Nathan Hughes, he's been looking at open world games as part of his PhD. We realised, first of all, 30% of players don't get anywhere near the actual narrative of the game. Okay, but they are still spending hundreds of hours playing this game. They're not playing the game. Okay, they're playing whatever they feel like they could do. Link could go off to the creature, or he could go and do the shrine, or he could go and rummage around the ruins to see if there's something interesting to find, or he might turn around and go off and do something else. And the game will let you do all of these things, and it doesn't matter. So what are we talking about when we say the experience of playing this game is immersive? There isn't an experience, not for even one player. It's one game, but whatever you do, it's a different experience every single time. Yet lots of people would say it's a great experience, but we'll have done completely different things. Okay? So not only are games not all the same, even individual games aren't the same for each player. It's also worth thinking about not all players are the same as well. And this really links to what I want to do is bring some work that I've been doing with the Able Gamers charity. The Able Gamers charity is an advocacy charity which is set up by Mark Barley and Steve Spohn to really bring, their motto is so everyone can game. Recognizing the value of games as a hugely significant cultural artifact, allowing people with disabilities to get access to games where previously they were unable to do so. So they're advocates for thinking about players with different abilities. They also do some engineering to build these tools. So you can see there, the player here is using that's a specially adapted controller, probably built by able gamers. Might have been partly bought and partly built by them to allow this player to be able to play the game that they want to play. And also they do education. So how did I get into this? I got into this, well, because I was working with Helen, who's very interested in accessibility, particularly around the web and making things available to people with visual impairments. But also with Chris Power, who was worked both closely with both Helen and I. And Chris got connected to Mark Barley with the Able Gamers charity. And then he said, we think we can do something in this area. We think we understand what we're talking about. We can talk about accessibility in games more usefully. And so the other thing as well is that the Able Gamers charity is really well connected to the players. They have Twitter feeds and things that people can use. And so the players with disabilities are talking to the Able Gamers all the time about what they see in games, how they might help, and they want to help. They want to get involved. So Jen Beeston, as part of her PhD, worked with us to really help us understand how to make accessible player experiences and got those players organized so we can actually use them as part of a pool, a resource for able gamers, for game developers to get involved in the development of games and tell us what the experience is like from their perspective. So at this point, when you're working with me, not disabled, I mean I've got bad vision, but I'm corrected, so I'm not disabled by the world around me. Me talking about people with disabilities, you've got to be really careful here. It's very easy just to assume, oh, they're those poor disabled people, I'll patronize you with what I think I know as a professor, and your life will be better. Versus, what the actual lived experiences of people is, but also we've got to be very careful. Do we think that people should have different experiences, are having different experiences, or do we need to sort of assume that they're having the same experience or could have the same experience, and does that matter? So we've got to be, you've got to be very open to realizing we don't understand what we're talking about unless we actually start to talk to the players themselves, which, if you like, is what we've been doing. I've been saying all along. So Chris and I set out to ask the very simple question of players, and we deliberately had two cohorts. We asked the people that Jen had got us connected to through the player panels that she developed. And we asked other people who didn't declare themselves as having a disability at a games conference. And we asked them a very simple question: why is gaming important to you? And just let people just talk, free-form answer, either on a Vox box to a video or typing in a piece of text, what they felt was important. Everybody, doesn't matter whether you declare disability or not, everybody says things like this. Games are important to them because it connects them to other people. We are connected to other people through games. We play socially. Those CSGO players, the 800,000 people who are probably still playing right now, they're connected both to their team members and they're playing against opponents who they may see regularly, and therefore they're feeling a sense of connection. And that social connection is really important for all players, regardless of where they come from. They're diverting. They're a distraction. They're a change of scene. They're escapist. People value that. We like something else. We like to watch television. We like to read books. And we like to play games for that reason. Some players recognize the artistry behind games, and I think if you could have seen it properly, the Zelda image, there's a certain aesthetic and charm and styling to these games which is appealing, and I think rightly classifies as art. And certainly the people who produce the graphics of these games are highly skilled artists, and the results are truly artistic and amazing. And Monument Valley is another example of taking art and putting it into an interactive game and making it another form of art in itself. Let's not forget, people like games because they're fun. Okay, that comes through as well. So why is gaming important to you? Because it's fun. Everybody says these sorts of things. There's a few other things that people say, but these are universals, if you like, that people say are important. But when we came to the players with disabilities, they also said something else. And that's something else we called enablement. They were telling us stories sometimes, or they were just telling us about their experience, which is when you have a disability, it affects your life in all sorts of interesting ways. And ways in which you can't necessarily do anything about. But when you play digital games, you're able to do some things which are otherwise closed off to you. Okay? You can roam across that mountain and look at the ruins. Okay? Now, in principle, I'm able-bodied. In principle, I could do those things, but in practice, we don't do those things. But we don't feel closed off in that way. Okay, we're choosing not to do these things, if you like. Whereas for some people, that's never going to be an option. It is closed off to them. Games offer them the opportunity to do things they would not ever be able to do in this world. It puts them on a level with others. You can play, and you can be enjoying playing. You can play a driving game, and with the right adaptations of controllers, extremely proficiently, and you're on the level playing field with others. And the other thing that came through from this is when you see a person with a very obvious physical disability, that's often the first thing we see about them, and that dominates our perception of them. On a game, the first thing you see of them is exactly what you see of everybody else, a figure, a character which represents them in the game, playing the game. And that allowed people to control their identity as a disabled person, whether they wanted to reveal it or not. And actually that idea of controlling identity comes through as well, particularly for women players thinking about controlling their identity because of toxic behaviours from male players in digital games as well. And so literally you get to play, some players actually saying they'd play a game, they'd win, and then they'd reveal that they had a disability by going, I literally beat you with one hand. Okay? And we got a quote there from directly from one of the players themselves. Gaming gives me barrier-free worlds where I can be equal with friends instead of being held back by my disability. Enablement is a unique experience to those with disabilities because of how the world disables them and holds them back. And games, in the right situations, can enable them and give them an experience which I wouldn't have otherwise realised was there. So I think that kind of, if you like, is the heart of the paradox. When we move from the subjective, the internal, this strange state inside my head, okay, we bring it out into the real world, and because it seems to behave as if it's a real thing out there in the world, like immersion, we can say, well, actually that experience of immersion is in some sense the same for all of us. We are in principle alike. But actually what we're also, and particularly working with the players with disabilities, is that you can't assume that we're alike. In principle we might be, but also in practice we might not be. And we need to understand that. So what we really have to do is ask each other how we're different. And that's, if you like, the heart of what I would summarize I've learned over the last 25 years looking at this, which is we are in many ways very alike, but we can't assume so, and we need to ask each other questions. Actually, this might just be common sense, and I'm just a slow learner, but I'm hoping we've done something quite specific in the context of games, which will take us forward. Where would I take this research forward? So I'm not deliberately posing like Mario. What would I do? I've listed a whole bunch of different experiences, different questionnaires, things that work, I know are relevant to games, and other people say are relevant to games as well. And we think we can measure them, but how do they fit together? Does uncertainty lead to more challenge? Does challenge lead you to being stuck? That's Francesca's PhD. Okay? But there's another question, which is I've been touching on all along, which is, are they even real? Have I got the right set of experiences? Is immersion one thing, or is it just a certain thing viewed from a certain angle, and actually there's several other different things that I'm not seeing hidden behind that? So immersion, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, but I'm not even sure it's real. And this is sort of drawing on some philosophy of science from Hae-Suk Chang, who was at UCL when I was there. The concept of temperature seems like a real thing, okay, but it had to be invented. And it started being invented by this feeling of touch. Then people managed to develop things like simple thermometers, which allowed them to measure simple temperatures in a modest range. So the temperature of water, for instance, from ice to steam, they could measure that reasonably reliably. But then you kind of take the mercury thermometer to Antarctica and you can get a reading of minus 300 degrees C. Minus 300 degrees, which we now know is impossible. But people at the time were thinking, wow, the Antarctica is really cold. Okay? It is, but it's not that cold. And so we invent new ways of connecting these different measuring tools together and slowly build up our knowledge. And now we think we have a really good understanding of what temperature is. When at the beginning we were just touching things and going hot, cold. I think in my research I'm touching things going hot, cold. And there's a lot to be learned now still to think about what are the deep concepts and what are the ways of extending this to different levels and hopefully refining these instruments. So I'm not just going hot and cold, I'm able to say precisely how cold, and whether that's different from other experiences elsewhere that we might be having. I've talked a lot about digital games because I started off by saying that unless we get experiences right, we can't really understand interactive systems. I think there's a key experience coming in and around autonomy, which is something which this department's very interested in. The key thing I think underpinning autonomy is that they're going to do things, these are agents in the social and physical world, robots, if you like, or driverless cars, whatever you like, which have agency and are acting in our world, our social world. And can we trust them? Trust is an experience. And I think to understand autonomy, I think we really need to start to think about what trust is. And I have touched upon this at various points along the way. People have trust in other players, in the game itself to be fair. But actually, I think we're a very, very long way from understanding what trust is and how it engenders. So I think that's the very big project for the next 25 years? Maybe, we'll see. So that brings me to the end, but I have to point out I've had a lot of help. This is a list. I hope this is a reliable list of my PhD students that I've first supervised, but there's a whole bunch of IGGY students who I've talked to, been involved with, enjoyed being with, and haven't managed to fit onto the slide there. Other colleagues from UCL, Middlesex, and here, of course, and elsewhere. And I couldn't possibly fit all of the MSc students and undergraduate students that I've worked with here as well. So a huge help, thank you to all of them for all of the work doing, well, playing with games, but also thank you to all for your time and attention this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for a very stimulating. I still don't understand games, but we have time for some questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please wait until we give you a microphone.
Okay, yes.
And you can probably field questions, Paul, but I can help. So.
Okay. Yeah. You need to have the microphone because for the people who are on the internet.
Okay.
Yeah, Susan first, thanks.
Thanks, that was fantastic. So why isn't Word as immersive as a game?
That's a really good question. I think it's all about the connection of work and the lining up of work, so that when you've got the challenge of writing a document, but actually it turns into the challenge of what the heck is it doing? Which is not, so really what you want is the challenge of writing a document, the challenge of running through the landscape effortlessly. And what you end up doing is going, which button is it? And I think that's partly why. But I would say, though, WordPresses are getting better. From 2002, when they were really annoying, they're just quite annoying. So, yeah, we're making progress. Thank you. I think Sarah Thompson had it.
Thanks, and thanks for a great lecture, Paul. So, if immersion is a thing, from a psychological point of view, other activities like reading have a different, I can think of that same spectrum of immersion of a book that you can't put down, you can't, you keep turning the page, and one where it's a bit of a chore just to read it. Is that the same thing psychologically, that immersive experience, or is it something different?
I believe it is, and very early on, actually, Rebecca Hong was an MSc student of mine at UCL, and she looked at reading, and actually her reading questionnaire was the start of the IEQ. We actually looked at that first. I think it is the same experience. My big theory, which is really difficult to prove, is that essentially what we're doing when reversed is we've got a model of another world in our head, and we're constantly updating that model through reading or interacting through the game and adding bits to that model, and that's really entertaining. So we enjoy that. We get feedback and we keep the model up to date. I think that's what immersion is. The hands are waving a lot here, okay? It's really, really hard to get on. And psychologists can get at some of these things, but at the scale at which immersion seems to happen, I think we haven't got the psychological tools really to get through that. But I think it's the same thing. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Paul. I actually used your questionnaire in some of the work that I've done. Isn't there a bit of a vicious circle here? Because we assume immersion exists, but we haven't got a rigorous definition for it. So then we measure it through some factors, and they then become the definition of immersion. Yes. So I'm
Yeah, absolutely. That's really true. And so there's a lovely word I like using here, which is, it makes me sound clever. It's called reification. Okay, what happens is, and that just means to make into a thing. Okay, so what we've done is we've taken a hard concept like immersion, and we've turned it into a questionnaire, and that thing is now immersion. And that's the problem, is we don't really know that, okay? We think it works the way we think this concept works. So we're happy to say that is the thing, but it's not. It's just, it's something we're talking, it's a sort of linguistic trick almost that we're playing on ourselves. The key thing would be that you get out of this loop in the way that you do with any scientific thing, which is you keep going around the loop. Okay, so you start off doing it badly, which is arguably at those early stages, hot to cold. Okay, but we go around the loop again with something else. And I've been working, so Joe Cutting in his PhD was looking at eye tracking. That's where we're sort of trying to see, now we've got something which we believe is immersion, can we use eye tracking to perhaps tap into that a bit better? Or can we use some other techniques? So can we use EEGs? People keep saying EEGs. No, EEGs don't work, okay? The brain waves are really, really complicated, okay? And so, but can we keep getting some other measure which then starts to take us around the circle again, but in a different way at a high level? And so I think we're at that sort of bottom level of not circling, but spiraling. So I think we'll get out of it eventually, but we're at early stages.
Thanks, Paul. Fascinating stuff. How about we take this out of games and go into other areas? So is there anything that's equivalent? Let me give you an example. If I'm driving a car and I'm concentrating,
Yep.
Is that a proxy for immersion? Is it something that's similar?
There's two things that might be going on there. It's a good question. It's a really nice question. So there are certainly times, you know, you're driving a car and you're really enjoying the experience of driving the car. You're in, you know, you're sort of in the flow, in the moment of the car's moving, and you're in control, and you're enjoying the road, and you're paying attention, and you're very alert and with it. I think that's immersion. You're immersed in the act of driving the car. But who hasn't also done the thing where you've driven the car back from the shops and gone, how did I get here? Okay, that's not immersion. That's automaticity. So you've pushed it down because it's driving is a skill. It can we can automatize all of these skills down to a level and not even notice we're doing them. That's not immersion. What we've been immersed in instead is what's on the radio or what the person in the car was talking to us about. Yeah. So, but I think you can have immersion in a car, but I would say it's rare. Because there's that, a lot of the time there's automaticity. There's a little bit of enjoying driving. Most is just getting annoyed with other cars. Okay. Yeah. So there's a couple over here, I think. Leo.
Thanks very much, Paul. That was a fascinating talk. I noticed a reference to Stephen Jay Gould's The Measure of Man, which you didn't talk about, but I think it has to do something with the reification. Oh, I don't know what's happening with me.
No, it's
with
okay.
the reification of concepts in the head. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, sorry, thanks
you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I went off script and didn't mention Stephen Jay Gould. I think Stephen Jay Gould, the methods used that I was describing for the sort of turning liquid items into scales, it's a method called factor analysis. And I think Stephen Jay Gould in The Mismeasurement of Man has, I think, one of the best populist descriptions of factor analysis, of what it's trying to do. And he's doing it around the concept of IQ. And trying to sort of point out that we can have a meaningful concept of IQ. You can argue about it, but it's as meaningful as immersion as far as I'm concerned. There's something going on there, which is IQ. But you can also think of it as two things, which is, if you like, a arithmetic IQ, a sort of a mathematical fluency, and a literal, sort of verbal fluency as well. So there's two concepts and one at the same time, and he describes that really beautifully. So I think, you know, and he is talking about, and he also, I mean, most of his book about is unpacking IQ is actually, is it a meaningful concept? And he does extremely well at sort of explaining how, yes, it is, but it's also not everything there is that's going on. So yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. It's a great book, and I recommend it to you. There's another question. Kester, I think was, sorry, in a moment, yeah.
Hi, Paul, thanks for that. I'm interested in that concept of enablement by the disabled players. Isn't that the same also for able-bodied players? I'm never going to kill a monster with a sword or shoot a spaceship myself.
Right. Yes. Now, this is where I think it's a really nice example of experience. Okay. What is an experience? We do get these experiences of, you know, fighting the monster with a sword or flying a spaceship and discovering a new planet. We do get these through games, and they're really important experiences. But I think what was important was the value that was put on them by disabled players, or players with disabilities. Because if you like, players like myself, you know, this is what you expect from a game. You get it from a game. It's great. It's fine. It's not really worth commenting on. It's that enablement is a thing that's worth commenting on. It becomes to the fore in the way that people kind of go, that's a really immersive game. It's come to the fore as worth expressing as its own experience that's singled out. So in some sense, we're all getting that sense of enablement, but actually as an experience that is valued by players, it is unique to those who aren't enabled otherwise. I'm not sure I've answered that question very well.
Looking to the future and autonomy, have you considered large language models that are actively polling the user to drive emotional engagement, like Replica AI?
So large language models, I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean.
So AI-driven chatbots that pretend to be your friend, but they pull you to drag you deeper and deeper into an engagement with a non-embodied agent.
Right. I haven't thought about those at all, but I can see where you're coming from, which is that essentially you're manipulating pushing the social buttons of a person. We've all got them. We are primarily social creatures, and so if you interact with us the right way, we behave in moderately predictable social ways, which you can then exploit. People have looked at those things. I mean, there's going back to the early history of HCIs, the use Reeves and Nass. I can't remember. I'm looking at Helen to try to rescue me here. The media equation. Is it Reeves and Nass?
Nass and...
Yes. Thank you. It's not just me.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So the media.
Nass and somebody.
It's Nass and somebody, isn't it? That's right. So the media equation is that idea that if a computer system behaves in the right way, we treat it as a social agent, and that could be quite detrimental. So I think also again we could, you can measure social experience, you can measure social engagement the right way. I don't have those instruments, but if you can measure it, you can then say, actually, this is an AI that's doing a bad thing. It's drawing you into a false social relationship in order to then do X, Y, and Z, something else. So yeah, you should be able to get hold of those things and study them. But you'd need to you need to tune your telescope correctly. Keep David working. That's what we like. Yeah.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for a really interesting lecture. The question is really about virtual reality, extended reality, those kind of new technologies. You didn't mention them in your talk.
Yeah.
How do you think they're going to change your subject or expand the tools that you have for this?
Yeah, VR is really interesting. I'll declare now, I don't really like VR. It makes me throw up. Okay? And I'm one of the 10% of the population for whom that's true. So there's a technology which is immediately excluding 10% of the population. So that's not a good thing for a start, okay? And I'm one of them, so I really don't like it. So, however, what is VR? VR is really just a screen. It's just a really, really clever screen. And so what it can do is fill up your sensory load, but actually sitting really close to something like this or having a really big one of these, that does more or less the same thing. So I think VR doesn't fundamentally change the experiences, the felt experiences going on inside here, but it does change the perceptual experiences and therefore can be kind of, if you like, more overwhelming, more full on. So I think it opens up increased intensity, but I don't think it's necessarily a given. And I think the key thing why the real reason why I think VR will remain relatively niche is that essentially to use a VR headset, you put a blindfold on. If I'm in VR, I'm not in this room, and I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to be here now wearing a VR headset, okay? However, AR, way more interesting. So having a screen that is essentially projected through this, so I'm looking at the physical world, but at the same time I'm looking at the digital world. That's really interesting, because then we can use stay behind the mic, we can use the physicality of this world to also be part of the digital world. And I think that's an opportunity for more actions, using more of our bodies, and therefore more embodiment, and therefore more different experiences related to the fact we are very embodied creatures. So I think AR rather than VR, and AR is not quite there yet, because you've got to wear a backpack basically to get the computing power to your glasses. Okay.
Right, I think we should let Paul have a drink now. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer more questions over drinks or via the various channels of communication we have these days. Yep. So can we thank Paul again for a really stimulating lecture. And I think there are things awaiting us outside.
Yeah, make your way outside. Make your way outside. I think there are things out there going on to enjoy.
so interesting to see your passion in games. It's